discussed a little while ago, came back to Russia after being poisoned by the Russian government after his recovery and was immediately imprisoned. And Alexei Navalny is still in prison. Right? So really what seems to be happening is more than at any other time, this Russian government, the one that Putin has led since the late 90s, really seems to be nervous. It's had some ups and downs. A lot of that has been driven by economic changes because Russia is very dependent on certain natural resource exports. And when the prices of those have gone down, the whole state's become a little more shaky. But overall, this really seems like the first major political crisis where the government is increasingly trying to arrest and prosecute supporters of Alexei Navalny, to break up protests, and seems increasingly concerned about something like what happened in the Ukraine in 2014 or what happened in Belarus in 2019, or I guess, yeah, I think right before Corona. In any case, what happened in those countries where you sort of have these mass protests that really sort of outstrip what the government is able to control. Now, one of the things that Putin has done historically in order to kind of boost his popularity domestically is, demonstrate that Russia is still a very powerful country, and oftentimes that involves the military. So Russia now has amassed 100,000 troops along the Ukrainian border, and this is near an area called Donbass. So last time Russia amassed a lot of troops along the Ukrainian border was during the Ukrainian Revolution in 2014, and Russia moved those troops into an area of the Ukraine called Crimea and essentially annexed that to Russia. And it was a bit of a tricky situation because it didn't ever really make that much sense that Crimea was part of Ukraine and not Russia, but at the same time, it was part of Ukraine, and they didn't discuss it with the Ukrainian government prior to doing it. Right. So now the massing of troops seems to be a prelude to doing something similar. Now, if you think about Russia, and if you can picture the map, I haven't included one in the slides, but Russia used to be the center of the Soviet Union, which was Russia as well as a bunch of countries that border Russia. And during that time, a lot of people that were Russian moved into those countries that were in the Soviet Union. And the borders between those countries are still very mixed between people that might identify more as Russian and people that might identify more as that country. So in the Ukraine, the further west you go, the more likely people are going to identify as Ukrainian. And the further east you go towards the Russian border, the more likely you are to find people that identify as Ukrainian and Russian, or identify more primarily as Russian. Right? And so one of the things that Russia has been doing is has been issuing passports to people that identify as Russian in this Donbass region. And a lot of people feel like this is a bit of a prelude to an attempt to annex that area. And this is actually something that Russia did in Georgia in 2008. So the northern parts of Georgia that were near the Russian border, the Russian government essentially said, well, the Georgian government is harassing and endangering these people. We have a responsibility to protect these Russians from the Georgian government. And a lot of people are saying it wouldn't be surprising if Russia soon attempts to do the same thing, right? So either by an actual military invasion or by trying to set something up that triggers some kind of military conflict, say by using operatives in Donbass, so people who are not wearing necessarily army uniforms and representing Russia, but are working on behalf of Russia to say attack Ukrainian police or something like that to trigger some kind of Ukrainian military response to try to control the region. And then when there's violence, Russia can say, well, see, we have to go in because the Ukrainian government is persecuting these innocent Russian civilians. So all of this seems very much related to the political conditions in Russia, as opposed to any kind of meaningful issues that are rising. And if anything, if there are issues in eastern Ukraine, most people will speculate that these are actually being initiated and controlled by the Russian government. So then the question becomes, what can other countries do to respond? The main thing that keeps the budget going in Russia is exports of natural gas, oil, and then some forestry and other products, things like that. So in theory, there could be an embargo on those exports. Now, the main consumer of those exports is the European Union, but really any kind of disruption in energy supplies in one part of the world changes the price in every part of the world. And since a lot of countries are now just starting to come out of the COVID recession, not very many people are super interested in triggering some kind of economic issues in the world that are going to raise energy prices, which would cause inflation. It would generally cause higher prices for people. Banks would have to raise interest rates. People would have to pay more to put gas in their car or heat their homes. So that's not really something that anyone is looking forward to. The article does mention a few things that I think are fairly reasonable responses, both to the jailing of Alexei Navalny, but also Russia massing these troops. It has never been clear to me why the European Union has been developing a larger natural gas pipeline. This is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because it's always seemed to me to make more sense for the European Union to be distancing itself from Russia rather than engaging. So in theory, that pipeline could be shut down. A lot of money that is generated through corruption in Russia is run through banks in the UK. And that's an area where the UK government could do a lot more to limit the amount of money laundering that's taking place. And in concert with that, there could be more targeted sanctions on leadership in Russia or oligarchs in Russia, people that are directly benefiting from that system. And the last recommendation is for NATO to deploy more troops around the Black Sea. This is sort of the contested border area that we're talking about, to demonstrate that they have a military presence and they're willing to do things to defend Ukraine. So there's a question like, does Russia hate Ukraine? And I don't really think that that is the point. And hopefully sort of this explanation kind of explains why between countries, it's very rarely an issue of a country hating another country. There's much more complex geopolitical things that are taking place. And in this case, it has a lot to do with Putin's hold on power domestically. All right. So a few weeks ago, we talked about how Brazil was in a complete COVID meltdown, and it was proving what happens when you don't have good policies in place and you deny that COVID is serious and you don't order vaccines, things like that. Very quickly, India has taken that spot. So India, with its 1.3, almost 1.4 billion people, is reporting more than 300,000 new COVID cases per day. And since the health system in India is not great, it's suspected that the number of cases per day are actually much higher than what is being reported. And in addition, the number of deaths is much higher than being reported. Strangely, India had a first wave of COVID that overall did not seem that bad. And a lot of people were surprised that, because it didn't seem like the government had a particularly good response. And a lot of people were anticipating that there would be a lot of people getting sick in India from COVID. And overall, not that many people did during the first wave. And so there's been lots of theories about, India has a much younger population than a country, say, like Italy, where a lot of older people became hospitalized and in cases died. And so maybe there just weren't enough older people to really see the magnitude. But now there's a strain which has been referred to as the double mutant COVID strain. And this seems to be driving far more illness. So it seems to be more contagious, as well as it makes people far sicker. And as a result, a lot more people in India are becoming critically ill. There has been sort of the worst case scenario of the shortages of key medical equipment, like oxygen for people who need additional oxygen when they're hospitalized in order to stay alive while their bodies fight the disease, and many other things. This has consequences, obvious consequences for people who live in India, but it also has consequences for the rest of the world. The first consequence is, as we've discussed, the more a virus like COVID is allowed to continue to spread within a population, the more likely we have increasingly virulent mutations of that virus, right? And so we have the double mutant virus now that could mutate further. And the worst case scenario that everyone should be really concerned about is the virus mutating to a point that all the vaccines that people are currently getting and that have been developed and are being produced is no longer effective against it. And that means we end up with a whole another round of a global pandemic, which would be very, very catastrophic. The next is that India is the largest vaccine producer in the world. And in the beginning of the year, just as vaccine production was really getting ramped up, India was exporting 64 million, well, roughly 20 million vaccines per month. In April, because India has been holding back more of these vaccine supplies for its own people, and because it's hard to make a lot of vaccines when people can't go to work because everyone is getting COVID and people have loved ones they need to care about and there aren't enough beds in hospitals. Well, India only exported 1.2 million vaccines in April. So it's having major ramifications for the vaccination efforts in other countries. Some things that have made this situation obviously worse include the fact that the last few months, there's been some major political campaigns happening for provincial government in India. Some of the provinces in India, have more than 100 million people. So these are, large elections, and people have been attending mass rallies. They haven't been social distancing. They haven't been wearing masks. These are likely spreader events. And the government just overall has not had a very good response. The government hasn't been encouraging people to avoid large gatherings, and it's not just the political rallies, it's also things along the lines of, there's been religious festivals that the government has encouraged people to continue attending, even though it's clearly unsafe to do so. India is now more aggressively rolling out their vaccinations and have hit 3 million vaccinations per day. But if you think about the size of the Indian population, 3 million vaccines per day actually isn't very many relative to the number of people that are going to need to be vaccinated. So in order to get it under control, they're likely going to have to continue to increase that rate of vaccination. And in the meantime, other countries are starting to ship medical supplies like oxygen canisters and things like that to people in India. I think I've answered that question. So there's a question, how come India doesn't tighten the rules? Well, there's a few reasons. A lot of this can be chalked up to bad governance, right? So part of it is that these are generally things that are not popular, but part of it is also the elections taking place that the government wants to, the current government in power, the BJP under Narendra Modi, he wants to be reelected, he wants to have big rallies, and he's not taking the appropriate steps to try to ensure that people are safe. So there's a question, Australia government refuses to let its citizens who've been to India in the last 2 weeks enter its customs. So I'm not aware of people not being allowed to travel back to Australia, but if you're saying they have to be quarantined or they have to obtain a negative COVID test or something like that, I think that is a totally reasonable precaution. Australia has been fairly restrictive in terms of Australians being able to travel to other countries. So I suspect anybody that recently traveled to India from Australia probably did so against the government's recommendations. And if they're now trying to return, it's probably reasonable that the government wants to place restrictions on their ability to do that, given that Australia, similar to China, has more or less gone back to people living normally. But at the same time, they're only able to do that so long as they don't have a lot of foreign travelers that could enter the country with COVID. So there's a question about getting oxygen. So the reality is the Earth's atmosphere, so the air we breathe, is something, I think, along the lines of 17% oxygen, something like that. So hospitals, when somebody is having trouble breathing, it means that they're not able to take deep breaths, they're not able to absorb the air effectively, and so they put them on oxygen, which means that 100% pure oxygen is entering into their lungs, and that's easier for somebody who has a lot of lung inflammation to absorb that oxygen. But no, you can't just sort of create pure oxygen, because it's a process that requires essentially industrial equipment to separate oxygen and to condense it and pack it into a canister. So that's kind of the idea. If you can't just sort of like scoop it out of the air, I guess would be the answer. I'm not an expert on how oxygen is sort of distilled and concentrated, but I know that it's not a process that you can sort of just do at home. You definitely need to have equipment in order to produce it. And I think the issue with India is not that they've never been able to produce it, it's that they can't produce it in the quantities that they need right now, which is the reason that they need other countries to supply oxygen to them. All right. So we got a Canada article, and since we have so many Canadians joining
Rudy,
us.
can I just interrupt you? Like somehow we lost your video. Could you just try to like for a while and
Okay. Let me see my video. So I've stopped my video. How's my video now?
yeah, good, you're back.
Okay, wonderful. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, like I was saying, we're going to talk a little bit about Canada. So, whereas a lot of countries have seen a fairly sharp increase in anti-immigrant sentiment, most notably the United States, Canada has released plans to admit 1.2 million new residents. There we go. 1.2 million residents over the next 3 years. And Canada's population is only about 40 million, even though the country's land mass is quite significant. So that's actually 3% of the population. So this is a huge influx of new residents, and it's going to happen in a couple of ways. So the first thing I want to do is kind of jump down to that bottom bullet point and just explain one of the things that Canada does in its immigration process is it tends to focus on what are called economic class migrants. And so this means that people who are interested in moving to Canada permanently essentially are graded on a point system that looks at, do they speak English or French, one of the two official languages? What is their educational background? And do they have a job offer, and are they likely to be able to obtain employment when they come to Canada? And since this is the focus of how people access Canada, if you look at different countries that have a high number of foreign-born residents, Canada actually has the highest education level of any of those countries, because the majority of people who come to Canada usually have degrees in STEM, and they're usually master's degrees or doctorates. So this program is going to look to, in some ways, increase that number of people, but it's also going to look to give more opportunities to people that we consider non-permanent residents. So these are people who are in Canada currently, but are on some kind of visa system. So that means that they were given permission to come into Canada, but it's a short-term position. So in some cases, these are people who come in on short-term work visas. So Canada has a fair number of people that travel from other countries to Canada to work in our agriculture sector, who sort of essentially come in usually for the summer and then leave during the winter and then come back. We also have, and this is a rapidly growing segment of the visa population, but it's students. So foreign students spend a huge amount of money attending schools in Canada. Primarily, these are tertiary schools, so universities, colleges, and I can say certainly, my experience teaching at York over the last 10 years, I've seen particularly the population of my classes change dramatically to be by far a majority foreign born, as opposed to when I started, where we had a fair number of foreign students, but it definitely didn't seem like the majority of students. So York is clearly a university that has prioritized increasing the number of foreign students. And the reality is it has a lot to do with the fact that domestic students pay significantly less tuition than foreign students. And so when the university can get more students who pay the full tuition, which is about 3 times the amount that a permanent Canadian citizen or Canadian permanent resident would pay. It helps to cover a lot of budget shortfalls that have been driven by budget cuts to universities over the last few decades. So there's going to be a greater focus on seeing if some of those students are interested in staying in Canada after they complete their education and creating more opportunities for them to apply to do so. And part of the idea is also that because it can be difficult to be a non-permanent resident because you may be dependent on a job and that leaves you open to coercion, or you may not feel like you can really pursue opportunities because you can't legally work in the country. For example, a student who's here on a student visa isn't able to get a paid job. Making more of these opportunities available to those people will hopefully improve their condition as well. Okay, going to a few questions. So Alex asked, do I think many Chinese students come to Canada and the States because of pressure in China? I'm guessing you mean pressure from parents in China, presumably. So, I mean, I think the reality is that a degree from a university in Canada or the United States is considered very, very prestigious almost anywhere you go in the world. And as much as Chinese universities have improved a lot, I think there is still a general belief that even a sort of let's call them like a second tier university in Canada is still at or near as prestigious as most universities in China. Obviously there's going to be some variation because there's some science programs at some of the top Chinese universities that are very, very prestigious and are very, very hard to get into. But generally speaking, a degree from a Canadian or American school, even if it's not Harvard or Princeton, still, I think, says a lot no matter where you travel in the world. And I think a lot of people are seeking that designation. So I think that's really the thing. I don't know that it's really a pressure. Okay. Last article we'll talk about, and then we will bring in Professor Zhang. So last article is about China. And I just found this a really interesting article because I hadn't really thought about this, but it makes a lot of sense. So I want to start by talking about the approach to technology firms and the government in the United States. So if you're not aware of this story, in 2015, the FBI obtained an iPhone from one of the San Bernardino shooters. So these were two people that committed a terrorist attack where they killed 14 people and injured a lot of others. And the FBI requested Apple's help in unlocking the phone because they wanted to see if there was useful information on the phone. For example, contacts, who these people had been phoning. So there's a pretty good case to be made that this is very useful information and is probably something the FBI should have access to, right? Apple's response was that it designs phones in a way that even it cannot unlock them, and it didn't want to build phones with a backdoor or research research how to hack their own phones. So their position, despite court orders that came, was to essentially fight those court orders. And to date, there isn't actually a requirement that Apple has to build systems that would allow the FBI access or even assist the FBI in getting into one of these phones. Now, the situation is very different in China, as we know, where companies are actually required to create backdoors specifically for government surveillance. So for example, WeChat, which is the most popular messaging app in China, all messages in WeChat have to pass through central servers in an unencrypted format so that they can be monitored and censored by the government. Similarly, as the internet protocols update to create more security between an individual's web browser and their banking or their investments or however they happen to be using their browser, those standards are actually banned in China. So the newest protocol is the TLS protocol, which is a more high security web protocol, and that's banned in China. Right? So I understood all of these things, but it had never occurred to me what some of the repercussions of these things would be. And the main repercussions are not just the surveillance side of things, which are fairly obvious, but it's that those security protocols that people have access to in terms of buying phones or using apps or using encrypted services, they don't just keep your information private from the government. They actually keep a lot of your information private from people that might want to, say, access your bank account or access your emails or do other things that would allow them to hack and control or steal sensitive information that you may have. So one of the unintended consequences of the Chinese surveillance state is that individuals have far less protection when they're online and when they're, just going about their daily lives. And I think this is very significant if you think about the increasing amount of connectivity we're going to have in the future. So one of the things that 5G is bringing us is it allows us to have far more devices all interconnected at the same time. So that, this is the future world is going to have far more digital currencies, and already people do a lot of their banking online. They pay each other with electronic money transfers. They buy things through web portals. Cars are increasingly online and are run by computers. We're going to have more autonomous vehicles that are going to have built-in online systems, sort of the way Tesla already has it. Homes, your thermostat and your door locks and your lights. More and more people are installing systems in their homes that allow them to control these from your phone. And potentially all of these things are going to be more vulnerable to Chinese citizens from people who want to hack their information. So I just generally thought that that was interesting. None of this really applies to the Chinese government because they internally use encryption systems and high security protocols and things like that. So it doesn't really allow greater foreign surveillance of what the Chinese government is doing, but it does potentially allow far greater foreign surveillance of what individual Chinese citizens are doing, because if the back door is there, you can figure out how to access it, even if it wasn't built for you. And it does mean that people that just might have nefarious intentions, like wanting to hack somebody's computer for whatever purpose, are going to have an easier time to do it because individuals are not given these same security options. So quickly on to, I guess, a couple questions. Sorry, Alex, I'm not really sure what your question is getting at. Grace is asking, I think the Chinese government forces those companies to do so because WeChat doesn't have incentive. Yeah, no, these are sort of exactly what I'm saying. China requires all companies to do this. So it's not something WeChat chooses to do. WeChat cannot operate unless they do this. They are required by law to do this, right? And that's sort of, that's again, sort of the contrast with an American company like Apple, where even when they receive a court order saying that they need to assist the FBI, refuses to participate and goes to court to fight the FBI on that order, and is willing to fight all the way to the Supreme Court if that's what it takes in order to assist even the government, and even in a terrorist shooting, to access encrypted data belonging to some of its customers. And there's another question, is this the reason some companies and platforms are banned in China because they refuse to these terms? Yes and no. It depends a little bit on the company. In Google's case, the reason Google operated in China for a period of time, but Google insisted on, when somebody searched terms that were being censored, Google insisted on including something in the search results that said certain results have been removed from your view. And the Chinese government insisted that they remove that, so that, because they didn't want people to be aware that certain results were being removed. And Google refused to do that. And then Google was removed from being able to operate in China, right? Okay. So we're at 8:30, and I think that it's time that we introduced our guest speaker. June, are you ready? Hey, nice to see you again.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Excellent. I sure can. And you can hear me?
Yes, sure. It's nice. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, June. Well, it's great to have you back and to talk again. So Really excited to talk about this week's topic. And I believe the first thing we were going to talk about is just sort of, what is the big deal about microchips? Why are these so important to the global economy?
Okay, so let me turn off this. So can I share my screen?
You should be able to.
Okay. So let me try. So are you able to see this properly?
Yeah, but I think you're sharing the presenter view. You may
Okay,
want
so I can swap. Yeah. So this happens all the time. All right, so okay, so I want to just be straightforward to talk about my first point. What is big deal about chips? So can you see and hear me properly, right?
yes, you're still showing the presenter view.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so I've done the swap. Okay. Any change?
Still the presenter view.
Okay, let me do it one more time. Otherwise, I will not give up. Any change?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, good. Yeah, so let's go ahead. Again, it's a great pleasure to share a bit of the big issue with all of you guys, and another wonderful opportunity to collaborate with Rudy on this. So I have prepared something, but we only have so much time. Let's come to my first point first. So I'm going to talk a little bit about chips. Of course, you know what it is, and it is semiconductors, not potato chips. So what's a big deal? So it's all started in the US, basically in 1947, when a group of scientists invented the first transistor, so led by Bill Shockley, who subsequently won the Nobel Prize. You know, the first transistor looked like this. It's really simple and crude, or I would say it's kind of ugly. It's not pretty at all. But it changed the whole world. And subsequently, it really became a huge deal. So the rest of the story is Shockley moved over from Bell Labs on the East Coast to Silicon Valley and started Shockley Semiconductor, and he hired a large group of brilliant scientists. But he was a lousy manager, so all those star scientists left him and subsequently formed Fairchild Semiconductor. That was officially basically the first semiconductor firm in the US and of the world. And that's basically the origin of the semiconductor sector. And from the first transistor, then they were able to come up with the integrated circuits, that is to put multiple transistors on a single device. And so first it occurred at Texas Instruments 1958, then it independently modified by a group of scientists led by the Intel founders, Bob Noyce, Ed Fairchild, and integrated circuits were first officially invented in around 1960. And so fast forward, this is what we have for iPhone 12. It's using a processor named A14, and on that little chip, basically the size of your fingernail, it contains about 12 billion transistors. Now, from a single one to 12 billion transistors in a single tiny chip. Think about that. I still think that's really just unimaginable. A useful analogy I just recently learned is that think about a 5-story building, and you have 2 million of them, and you put all of them on top of your fingernail, probably more. So that's what have been achieved by human beings. So I consider the semiconductor as basically to date the greatest human and intellectual achievements, and the economic and the manufacturing achievement as well. So that's why it's a big deal. So from there, originally it was like everything was handmade, and the total cost probably just a few $1,000s. But then increasingly, the cost of building semiconductors has skyrocketed to close to like $10 billion for a single factory as of today. And it's becoming super sophisticated, complicated, and to me, so that's the amazing evolution of division of labor, as argued originally by Adam Smith. So it has become a very complicated so-called ecosystem, or a production network, or a value chain system, from design to manufacturing to assembly and testing, and to other supporting functions. And also, especially importantly, the equipment manufacturing has become super important. I'm going to talk about that later on. So as Rudy just mentioned at the start, now we are living in a world that cannot survive without chips. And you probably noticed we are experiencing a serious semiconductor shortage. That is because cars are using more and more semiconductors, and they become smarter and smarter. That put a great stress on demand. So basically, everything, all the electronics we use depend on chips or semiconductors. The semiconductors itself form a global market of about $500 billion, but that is behind a global market of ICTs or electronic products, or combined of like $6 trillion. But it's not only just important for civilian uses, including for like medical equipment that we are using because of the pressure added by COVID. But also it's critical for military purposes. Without the most advanced chips, you basically cannot imagine to win a war as of today. So that's why it's such a big deal. So basically, people are arguing that the whole planet now is running by computer chips, and that is at the core of our today's life, and getting increasingly important, and it's at the core of all the future industry. And that's why it has become at the heart of the US-China tech war. So over to you, Rudy.
Well, I guess the next issue would be to talk about how is this war being fought between China and the United States?
Okay, let's talk about it. I have exited this. Come on.
Control F. We'll put it back
Control-
in there.
Okay, Control F. All right, so. Oh. All right, okay.
Or you can also click down at the bottom. There's next to comments. If you look at the fourth icon, oh, perfect,
Okay,
perfect.
all right, let's go. All right, so, but the screen, no, sorry. I'm using two screens here. It's a bit awkward. All right, let me shift it here. Mhm. Okay, I hope you can see the right screen. So let me talk about it, how the war is being fought. I have done a lot of study on this. Actually, it could be quite complicated. So simply speaking, the US is on the offensive end and China is on the defensive end, which is understandable, because the technology originated in the US and the US is still the dominant player in the whole industry as of today, as I'm going to come to more details later on. So, we talk about the Huawei, which was being placed on the American entity list and everything, all the transactions dealing with Huawei got to be approved, and for example, TSMC was not making chips for Huawei, so it became a big constraint to the company. So this is just an example. So basically the U.S. had a tradition of export control, which is understandable and it's a common sense because you don't want to export valuable stuff, especially the weapons, to your enemies. So that has a long tradition, but more recently it ended up with a reformed new law called Export Control Reform Act of 2018, and plus another component, and they together form so-called the National Defense Authorization Act of 2018. So now it is a official sort of legal document in the U.S. And under that law, they regulate or maintain a number of entity lists, actually kind of a blacklist, and through multiple government agents under Department of Commerce and also the Treasury Department and the Department of Defense, etc. So they maintain a growing list of countries, of firms, organizations, and even individuals. I just checked one of the list. It has 1,500 pages, as you can imagine. And basically that purpose is to control core US originated technologies in the name of emerging technologies, foundational technologies, critical technologies, dual use technologies related to the military, and so that they would control sort of the destination of those technologies. So basically that's how that system works. There are lots of details I cannot go into. And so for example, the Huawei, so if a product is manufactured in the US, and if you are to export to Huawei, it got to be checked. But if it's not produced in the US, but it has over 25% of the US origin control technologies, it also got to be approved or disapproved. So through time, the US has put a growing and enlarging massive list, basically, or interestingly, containing all those of key technologies as identified by Made in China 2025. So you can see this is, even though the American policy is not directly targeting China, but it emerged in the context of fighting the tech war against China. And this export control is not just a bilateral, but also a multilateral, especially through the so-called Wassenaar Agreement with 42 members. Even though Taiwan is not a member, we're going to talk about that later on. But the dual use technology, especially semiconductors, is a core component of this arrangement. And through this multilateral arrangement, so the whole, we can say the Western world of constitutional democracy could like deal with China, Russia, and other, standing at the other direction. So a semiconductor is featured very high in this control. And another major sort of way of fighting the war from US side is to block any sort of effort or proposal to acquire a American tech firm, or especially in the semiconductor sector. So there were many proposals. So for example, Tsinghua Ziguang, Tsinghua Unit Group proposed to buy Micron Technology and other major American firms, but never approved. Basically, it's all rejected, as you can imagine. And another common approach is to through kind of the diplomatic measures and pressures. For example, the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo went to the Netherlands to add pressure to their prime minister, not to sell the EUV machine from ASML to SMIC, which is something absolutely critical. Without that, China wouldn't be able to make any advanced chips. So this is one large story. I will come back to some of the related issues later on, and finally, when the sort of the geopolitics and diplomatic conflicts are concerned, Taiwan has become just quite a hot topic, especially a recent Economist cover story made a provocative argument to name Taiwan as the most dangerous place on Earth. But why it's dangerous? Because it's caught in between the conflict of U.S. and China, and because of the prominence of TSMC or Taijidian, which has become basically the most advanced semiconductor manufacturer of the whole world, leading Samsung and Intel putting them behind. And the tiny island of Taiwan has become basically the hottest spot of semiconductors, and producing about close to a quarter of semiconductors, especially of the high-end ones. So that's why it also become a hotspot of the sort of the crossfire, especially related to semiconductors. But on the Chinese end, it is to just to try to become self-sufficient, given sort of the American pressure. So the whole country is like has been mobilized to another sort of semiconductor leap forward. The Chinese are familiar with the great leap forward, 大跃进 of 1958. So very much likely, so we are witnessing a massive movement of developing the semiconductor industry to become self-sufficient by our means. Of course, our observations are quite mixed. There are obviously frauds and opportunistic behaviors, but that's another issue. But also significant strides have been achieved as well. But on the U.S. end, it's also trying to fight back and to respond and to address its weakness, especially on the manufacturer end. So Trump administration already solicited TSMC to open up a new plant of a $12 billion investment in Arizona, and Intel recently announced to spend $20 billion to start 2 plants in Arizona as well to form a huge cluster in the US to boost its production capacities. And this kind of along with the issue of China-US conflict and the semiconductor shortage, Joe Biden has made also a remarkable statement holding a chip in his hand just to stress the importance and the sort of determination of the US also to protect its value chain and its technological leadership. All right, so I think this is my response to the second big question. Yeah.
Well, then we should move on to the third, which would be the comparative chip power, and maybe what countries need to do to catch up. My understanding is that TSMC is, I've heard it stated they're 10 years further than any other firm in terms of their technology, which seems like a staggering technology gap. And I can't think of any other industry where people would say something that one country is or one company is that much further ahead than any other. So maybe you could discuss the comparative, what different countries can manufacture and how that compares to TSMC.
Okay, that's actually a quite technical issue with a lot of uncertainties. But I think you said like 10 years, could be right, but it could be 5 years, could be 15 years, and especially because the Moore's law, and if is coming to its end, so it's adding more uncertainty, and also what was more progress, and when the technology becomes more advanced, there would be added difficulty and therefore more difficult to do the prediction, things like that. But basically, TSMC has just been amazing. As a latecomer, it's now its market value is like 3 times of Intel. So as you can tell, and so that's why it also a significant player in this chip war. And so in terms of the comparative sort of advantage or strengths and weakness of the US and China, I just want to make it really simple, or even though there are many details and the technical aspects that you can think of. Basically, the semiconductor sector, as I mentioned, it has formed a sophisticated ecosystem or value chain. Therefore, if you are to become independent or successful by yourself, you need to do it all by yourself, and also need to have strengths on all the elements or components of the whole ecosystem, basically from the upstream materials to machineries, equipments, to this architecture design, to design softwares or electronic design tools, and to manufacturing capacity, and to packing and testing and so on. So it's a sophisticated value chain. And so far as you can see from here, so the dark blue representing the US is dominant in sort of the design and software tools in core IP or architecture design, and in the manufacturing and design of logic chips, and DAO means discrete chips and analog and others, and memory chips and manufacturing equipment. All these major areas are still quite dominated by the US. And in terms of the supply materials and wafer fabrication and assembly and packaging, China has made some inroads in these areas, especially the least demanding and the least value added, which is the final procedure of assembly, packing, and testing. So China is occupying a market share of close to 50%, but in all the other areas is still just accounting for a minimal share of the global system. So in terms of products, the semiconductors can be primarily divided into memory chips and logic chips, basically the processors, CPUs. So again, if we look at China, in terms of memory chips, it has made some achievements, especially through Yangtze Memory, Changjiang Cunchu at Wuhan. We can talk about that if we have time, but in logics, in processors, that's the most advanced one, which is represented by TSMC. Smaller than 10 nanometer technology, it's almost exclusively dominated by TSMC. So the new iPhone chip is exclusively produced by TSMC's 5 nanometer technology, but China had some significant proportion only at those technologies like several generations behind, like above 14 nanometers and so on. So you can see the gap here basically already. So again, I have talked about the ecosystem. So basically, when all the components are considered, so the US is still dominant in most aspects, especially chip design, IP, design software, and the equipments, and also advanced materials and chemicals. On these, China's foreign dependence is just close to 100%. But China is making some progress, primarily, on the lower end of packing and assembly and testing. So interesting, China is the largest chip market and of the world, but the Chinese market is dominated by U.S. firms of about 50%, and the U.S. basically accounts for 40 to 50% of the entire global market. So it's the absolute dominant force. So that's why they are fighting such a war, but was very devastating global consequences. All right, so that's it.
Sounds good. Well,
yeah, it takes a lot of time. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're about at 9 p.m. So we need to wrap up about now, but I'm just wondering if you had any final thoughts just about what you thought was going to be sort of the long-term direction. Do you think that this separation will just sort of continue and we'll have different strains of technology developing in China versus in the US? Or do you think that this is kind of a temporary separation, and in the long run, these supply chains will come back together? But we do have to, it has to be sort of 2-minute answer.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I just come to my last slide. So at the moment, it's a deadlock. And Joe Biden is not changing basically any of the major approaches initiated by Trump. So the conflict and the fight continues, and I believe this antagonism between China and the U.S. or between China and the West would be more or less, if not permanent, but would certainly be long term, and with very predictable consequences and futures, including when Taiwan and TSMC is concerned. So because of semiconductors are such a big deal, both to the entire function of the economy, to the surveillance state, as you mentioned, and to fight any future wars. So nobody is going to yield so easily. But ironically, we have already formed such a sophisticated, wonderful, advanced global division of labor and global ecosystem of semiconductors and electronics. So basically, I would argue, no one could even survive, not to say thrive, by isolating itself. Even the US couldn't survive if it's isolated. So, but the dilemma is, the conflict is unavoidable, and the pressure from the U.S. is unavoidable. So, and China has become so nationalistic and so determined, and also so confident of marching forward. So it's trying to become self-sufficient. That's why the U.S. side is also concerned, because it's very costly, given China is the largest market. So it's going to be very unfortunate to every party and to the whole world. But unfortunately, it's unavoidable. So China is marching forward. I believe the future depends on the level and the depth of decoupling. And if it reaches like near complete decoupling, and then I believe the Chinese system will become paralyzed, and at least it will be separated from the high-end semiconductors for quite a while. And I even think it's impossible to just to reach the cutting-edge technology as like TSMC has reached. But if it's only partial decoupling, China still can get away with that to have access to the key technologies and the components, and also especially the EUV machines from ASML. Then I believe China may be able to progress fast and to reduce the gap between China and the US.